In Chapter 18, we'll discuss cognitive development as it occurs in emerging adulthood. So in regard to cognitive development, there's a few different approaches that psychologists have utilized in discussing or understanding or analyzing cognitive development. The first of these is called the stage approach. And basically, that just describes shifts that occur in thought processes, and each of those shifts is referred to as a stage. So, as in, like maybe the first stage cognitive development or the second stage, et cetera, et cetera. The second term is called psychometric approach. And that is basically, that analyzes intelligence longitudinally using various tests. And what's important to understand here is that term right there, longitudinally, is that refers to observing and measuring through a long period of time, over an extended period of time. So that can be, like analyzing intelligence from, age 15 all the way up into 25 or something. And that would be the longitudinal approach. And third on this list, we have what's called information processing approach. That's a term that just refers to basically it looks at how the brain, how it encodes, stores, and retrieves information. And it's usually compared or paralleled with computers. So information processing approach, basically it operates from the idea that our brains actually functions the way computers do. And what's important here on this slide right here is this term called post-formal thought. And that's considered sometimes called the fifth stage of cognitive development, or it's also kind of considered as being the highest stage of cognitive development. And but that's it's characterized by being a little more practical, a little more flexible, and more creative. It usually employs formal analysis, definitely, which means taking time, analyzing things before coming to a judgment. And it's also characterized by the facts that that a person who is using post-formal thought processes is less impulsive and reactive, and is more practical and imaginative in how they use their mental processes. Now, one thing that's important in discussing this phase of development is the idea of using time well. And they refer to time management. And that is often a struggle for emerging adults, and but it's usually as cognition matures that the young adults will actually gain more skill at time management. And it says, they mention that, that it's a little more characteristic of part-time college students. They have in general, have sometimes a tough time in determining and learning how to manage their time wisely and effectively. Okay, another term on this list here is what's called delay discounting, and they refer to it as the tendency to undervalue, ignore future consequences and rewards in favor of immediate gratification. So basically, that refers to the tendency to maybe not think ahead and take into consideration the effects of one's thoughts and behaviors. And it says that actually tends to reduce as we age as a result of our prefrontal cortex maturing a little more. And if you remember from previous discussions, the prefrontal cortex is what's strongly associated with what's called So the prefrontal cortex is strongly associated with what's called executive functions, which is the ability to think ahead, make plans, and think logically. Okay, moving on. Okay, so here's an example. They just mentioned this. I just left this in because I thought it was mildly amusing. But here's a photo at a student center at a college, and this is an all-night study cramming experience, social experience, before an exam. And they mention, they say this is contrary to what scientific evidence proposes is the best way to learn. And they ask, do you know what this is? Now, I put in here in italics and in red here, I'd like to, I mentioned that, hey, this is contrary to what scientific evidence has shown is the best way to learn. So actually, cognitive science and learning sciences have determined that the best way to learn is through what's called distributed practice, which means studying consistently throughout the semester, not bunching it all right at the end. Not waiting until the night before an exam or an assignment is due and then starting it 2 hours before you're going to submit it or something like that. Those are just some examples. Okay, and they talk about the importance of stereotypes and how they affect one at this stage of development, and so they use the term stereotype threat. And the actual formal definition here that they posit is it's the possibility that one's appearance or behavior will be misread to confirm another's oversimplified, prejudiced attitudes. And often that stereotype threat, it's actually self-imposed. And they mention, that it can be prejudiced, by gender or prejudiced, by different like cultures, ethnicities and things like that. And also they mention, that it suggests that the mere possibility of being negatively stereotyped, that actually can arouse one's anxiety, and which results in disrupted cognition, distorted emotional regulation, and achievements overall. And now we're still talking about post-formal thought, and they refer to this also as one component of that is what's called dialectical thought. And I actually put in a thought here at the very beginning. I just wanted you to be aware of the term dialectic, which is in red. That refers to it's a philosophical concept, and it's the idea that every idea or truth bears within itself the opposite idea or truth. So to put it in simpler terms, if you've ever heard of the phrase, there's two sides to every coin, or no matter how thin you slice it, there's still two sides. That refers to, that's kind of the dialectic principle. So I just wanted to include that in here for you to be aware of and get a little more insight into what the term dialectical even means. Okay, so post-formal thought, as I mentioned earlier, it's considered the most advanced cognitive process. And so it's characterized by ability to consider a thesis and its antithesis and arrive at a synthesis. And we will take a look at those in the next slide, what those three terms refer to, and maybe get some further insight into those. So additionally, it says, that also includes being able to see the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, possibilities and limitations of certain choices, certain ways of thinking, certain types of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So they say that's that type of reasoning. It's very rare in adolescence, and it's more often found in middle-aged people. And so you might want to take a moment and consider, like, why would that be the case? Okay, so as we mentioned in the previous slide, that every idea or truth bears within itself the opposite idea or truth. Remember, that's called the dialectical principle. And so they use the term, the ability to consider a thesis. And a thesis, all that means is a statement of one's belief. And an antithesis, that's a statement of belief that opposes the thesis. So that just means, it's a belief that is the opposite. And finally, synthesis, that's a new idea that it actually combines both the thesis and the antithesis. It actually combines them, it integrates them. And that hopefully will lead to a more comprehensive, a broader overview that will lead to a more comprehensive level of truth. Two important terms here to consider are the types of thought known as subjective thought and objective thought. Now, they mention here, that adolescents, they tend to use, either objective or subjective reasoning, but adults can combine the two. So that's something important to keep in mind, get into emerging adulthood, that those individuals can actually combine the two types of thinking instead of relying on just one, being dominant in one or the other. So just let's quickly define those. So subjective thought, that's thinking, that's based on on personal qualities of the thinker. So things like they mention, here's some examples like experiences, culture, goals. So on the other hand, objective thought, that's thinking that is not based on the thinker's personal qualities, but instead it's based on valid facts and numbers. So one could see by looking at those, the subjective and the objective, how actually synthesizing the two, combining and using both of those in one's thinking processes, would actually probably lead to a more comprehensive truth. The term cognitive flexibility, kind of, if you just think about it, cognitive means mental processes, and flexibility just means ability just to not be rigid in one's approach, thinking approach or reasoning approaches. A little more, flexible, no pun intended. So cognitive flexibility, it's known as a characteristic. It's more common in emerging adults than in younger people. And so it mentions a few things, to think about in regard to that. And I recommend you stop the video here and actually just quickly read through these and gain a little further insight into that. We'll move on. So as we were talking about dialectics or dialectical reasoning, one thing to keep in mind is culture. One's culture greatly influences types of dialectical reasoning. And they mention here, that Asians tend to think, more holistically and seek synthesis. And colleagues, so that makes, it makes more sense because as we've determined in previous chapters and other psychology courses, that Asian cultures, they tend to be what called collectivistic cultures. where they, are more concerned with their how they fit in with their society, with their environment, with their family, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just something to consider. And another thing to consider too when looking into emerging adulthood is moralistic type growth. Moral, growth in one's moral values and everything. So they mentioned this term called the defining issues test, and that's nothing more than a test that measures, moral thinking. And it has the test takers, they actually just rank possible solutions to moral dilemmas. And so basically what's important to know from this slide here is that one's moral growth, as measured by something like the defining issues test, that actually rises, gets a little more highly developed with age, because adults gradually become less doctrinaire and self-serving and more flexible and altruistic. Now, a couple things here, things like faith, and religion and things, definitely, are, can be an important part in one's life and development and everything. And so they just mention, there are gender differences in faith and practice. And so they just mention very quickly, remember, these are generalizations, but generally, women tend to be more apt to attend religious services and identify with a religion than do men. They mention down here that there are other things that can affect that, that affect one's faith and practice. And that can be things like, education, specific dilemmas, and one's culture. And looking a little more into the, gender differences in moral development, so there's what's called the morality of care, and that's the tendency of females to be a little more reluctant to judge right and wrong in absolute terms, and that's due to their socializations, because that's just the way in certain cultures, that's just the way. That's what women do. They don't judge, in absolute terms, what is right and wrong. Where on the other hand, males tend to emphasize, being, just over compassion. They emphasize justice over compassion, and to judge right and wrong in absolute terms. And that's called morality of justice. Now, cultural differences here. We're going to take a look at this theory of moral development, and that what it does is it suggests that distinct clusters of moral development occur in specific cultures. And actually many or even most cultures, and things. They give some examples. Like care for others. Be fair, don't cheat, be pure, seek purity, avoid contamination, respect authority, don't break laws, things like that. Those are fairly common, what they call clusters of moral development through different cultures. Now we're going to continue on and just talk about cognitive growth. And they've determined, that higher education, it suggests that over the first couple years that college students generally don't make, substantial cognitive advances. That usually occurs later on through college. But that was just observed, and so they're just saying, that the reason why that might be true is, for one thing, colleges have kind of changed a little bit. That things, like maybe being less rigorous than they were in the past, and the adoption of what's called the corporate model, which views students as customers. Some colleges are like that. So that's just something to keep in mind there. And also, looking at this slide right here, they just mentioned, that better instruction, that is usually characterized, by things like better classroom instruction, engaging learners more effective use of current technology, advanced technology, as well as offering, online options. All those lead to better instruction and hopefully more cognitive growth. Okay, and we're still talking about college here, but now we're going to look into diversity. And because, colleges strive to support more diversity and everything, there's this term called massification, and that is just basically just refers to the fact that college is now for the masses, not just the elite. So that's just something to keep in mind here. And let's see here. Let's move on. So they talk about there's many forms of diversity, and I would urge you to pause the video here and just take a look at these on your own. Then a couple of things measuring some of the pros about diversity in college and education. And number one is increased diversity at a college or of the student body is more likely to encourage rather than discourage cognition. So that's an important thing that I found in this slide that I think you should consider. Okay, and I'm going to move on from here, but feel free to stop and look at this if you like. And so that concludes our discussion, and we will continue with the other components of emerging adulthood on the next chapter.